GoPro was still recording, its tiny red light a single blinking eye in the gloom of the forest floor. When the search party found the mangled bike 3 days later, its high-tech carbon frame was twisted into a grotesque sculpture, as if some primordial giant had wrung it out like a wet towel. In the final 90 seconds before the battery died, the camera's lens captured the entirety of the impossible afternoon. It captured the desperate, frantic pedaling, visible in the violent jerks of the handlebars as Derek Hutchinson fought to maintain control at speeds no mountain bike should ever reach on a narrow, root-choked trail. It captured his ragged, panicked breathing, short, sharp gasps that the microphone picked up over the high-pitched whine of the bike chain and the percussive thunder of knobby tires hammering over rocks. And underneath it all, a sound that defied nature, the synchronized heavy percussion of footfalls that should not exist. Derek's helmet cam footage, once recovered, showed 3 massive dark shapes flanking him as he fled through the dense Oregon forest. They held their bodies low to the ground, moving in a powerful knuckle-walking gait that was disturbingly similar to a charging gorilla. Except these things moved with a speed that would make an Olympic sprinter weep. The footage showed them keeping perfect, effortless pace with the bike, even as Derek pushed 30 miles per hour down a trail barely 3 feet wide. Their massive arms propelled them forward with a terrifying rhythm that spoke of immense strength and practiced coordination. If you slowed the footage, watching frame by frame, you could see them communicating with quick, subtle head movements and wet, clicking sounds that no known animal makes, adjusting their positions to maintain a perfect tactical formation on either side of the trail and behind him. The camera captured the exact moment they drove him toward the ravine. They worked together with the cold, tactical precision of a wolf pack, separating a weak caribou from the herd, except these were not wolves, and Derek was no weak animal. He was a man on a machine, a union of flesh and metal, using every ounce of skill and strength he possessed to survive, and it still wasn't enough. The footage showed the shape on the left accelerating suddenly, a blur of dark fur, forcing Derek to veer right toward the precipice, where the trail crumbled into empty space. It showed the shape on the right, timing its move perfectly, lunging forward at the exact moment Derek tried to correct his trajectory, cutting off his only escape route. And it showed the third shape, the one behind, putting on a final terrifying burst of speed that sent Derek and his bike sailing over the edge in a cloud of splintered wood and absolute panic. What the camera didn't show, because by then Derek was airborne, and the GoPro was recording nothing but a dizzying spiral of sky and blurred tree branches, was what happened after he crashed through the rotted wooden guardrail, marking the edge of Blackridge Canyon. It didn't show the 40-foot drop into the churning creek below, or the way his body tumbled through space, his feet still partially clipped to the pedals of his ruined bike. It didn't show the brutal impact with the water, the terrible, paralyzing cold, or the moment Derek was certain he would drown in a mountain creek because his concussed brain couldn't remember which way was up. Most importantly, it didn't show why the creatures, after so methodically hunting him, didn't follow him down to finish what they'd started. The ravine wall was easily climbable, and Derek was as helpless as a newborn in that freezing water. They simply let him go. The police, in their official report, would call the footage a hoax. An elaborate setup, they suggested, probably involving friends in gorilla suits and clever video editing. They argued the shapes were nothing more than shadows cast by the dense forest canopy, lens artifacts from the cheap Chinese GoPro clone Derek had bought on Amazon, visual noise that his traumatized mind had warped into monsters. They said Derek had simply lost control on a notoriously dangerous section of trail, crashed spectacularly, and then constructed an elaborate fantasy to explain away his own mistake. The human mind does that, they explained with professional, condescending sympathy. When we experience severe trauma, Our brains create narratives to make sense of the senseless. Derek had imagined the creatures because it was easier than accepting that he'd nearly died because of his own carelessness. But Derek knew better. He had been there. In those final seconds before he went over the edge, he had seen their eyes, 3 sets of yellow gold orbs that seemed to glow with their own internal light. Eyes that tracked his every movement with an intelligence that was unmistakable and absolutely terrifying. He had smelled their stench, a reek of rot and wildness worse than any roadkill, worse than the dead elk he'd once found decomposing in the August heat, worse than anything nature should be able to produce. He had heard their guttural breathing and the wet clicking sounds they used to communicate, vocalizations that started deep in the chest and sounded like nothing that should emerge from any throat on earth. And he had felt it, in those 90 seconds of pure, distilled terror as they herded him toward the ravine. He had felt the unmistakable sensation of being hunted by something that understood exactly what it was doing. This wasn't the random aggression of a surprised bear or the defensive charge of a startled elk. This was calculated, purposeful hunting. They had worked together. They had communicated, coordinated, and executed a plan. And then, for reasons he would never understand, they had let him go. This is the story of what really happened on Black Ridge Trail during 7 days. In September, that began with a simple training ride and ended with Derek Hutchinson learning a truth that most people will never believe, and that a part of him still wishes he'd never discovered. The morning of September 14th dawned grey and cold over the Cascade foothills. Derek Hutchinson loaded his Trek Fuel X mountain bike onto the rack of his Ford Ranger at exactly 6:15, his movements practiced and efficient. The bike was his pride, a top-of-the-line machine he'd saved for months to buy. At 32, Derek had been riding these mountains since high school. He worked as a hydraulic systems technician at the paper mill, 4 10-hour shifts that gave him long weekends to pursue his obsession. His ex-girlfriend Jennifer had called it an addiction, a way to avoid dealing with real life. Derek preferred to think of it as focus. The trails were his church, the only place his anxious mind truly quieted. This morning was special. For 3 weeks, Derek had been planning to explore a faint line he'd spotted on Google Earth, deep in a remote section of the Umpqua National Forest labeled Devil's Hollow. The area was surrounded by steep ridges, filled with the kind of massive old-growth Douglas firs that had escaped the logging boom. The old-timers at the bike shop warned him away from it, saying the access was too difficult, the trails too overgrown. That only made him more determined. He packed extra water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and his fully charged GoPro, mounted securely on his helmet. He reached the Black Ridge trailhead by 7:30. The gravel lot was empty, save for a rusted-out Subaru being slowly swallowed by blackberry vines. The air was crisp, smelling of wet earth and Douglas fir. After his routine bike check, he clipped into his pedals and started up the trail. The first few miles were a steady climb through second-growth forest, the ground carpeted with sword ferns still heavy with morning dew. By mile 2, he found his rhythm, the pedaling almost effortless, his mind settling into the meditative state he cherished. The forest gradually transformed as he climbed higher. The uniform young trees gave way to massive, ancient Douglas firs, western hemlocks, and colossal red cedars. The understory grew thicker, a dense wall of salal, Oregon grape, and spiny devil's club. At mile 7, he saw the first unusual thing. A black-tailed doe stood beside the trail, closer than any deer had ever let him get. She wasn't looking at him. Her body was rigid, every muscle tensed, her ears locked on something deep in the trees to the north. The whites of her eyes were showing, a clear sign of terror. Derek stopped, following her gaze, but saw nothing. Then he noticed the silence. The usual chorus of Stella's jays and chattering squirrels had ceased. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath. Suddenly, the doe exploded into motion, not down the trail, but crashing directly into the dense undergrowth to the south, away from whatever she'd been watching. But Derek heard nothing, no breaking branches, no heavy footfalls. She simply vanished into the vegetation without a sound, an impossible feat for a panicked, fleeing deer. The silence she left behind was more unnerving than any noise. A primal instinct, long dormant, whispered that something was deeply wrong. Shaking off the unease, he pushed on. The cloud cover thickened, plunging the forest into a gloomy twilight. The temperature dropped, and a cold wind began to stir the high branches. At mile 9, he reached the junction. A weathered, bullet-scarred sign read, "Trail closed. Hazardous conditions." The path into Devil's Hollow to his left was barely visible, descending sharply into a dark ravine. This was it. He checked his GoPro's blinking red light, took a deep breath, and started down. The descent was brutally technical. The trail was a slick carpet of pine needles, hiding wheel-trapping roots and moss-covered rocks. Within minutes, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. He was riding through a tunnel of waist-high sword ferns and spiny devil's club, surrounded by true old-growth giants. The Douglas firs were 10 feet in diameter, their crowns lost in the gloom hundreds of feet above. The air grew heavy, thick with the musty, cloying odor of perpetual decay. It was here, in this cathedral of shadows, that Derek began to feel watched. It started as a faint prickle between his shoulder blades, an instinctive awareness that he was not alone. The feeling grew, intensifying with every pedal stroke deeper into the hollow. He stopped several times, standing in the profound silence, scanning the impenetrable walls of green on either side of the trail. He saw nothing, but he couldn't shake the sensation. He saw flickers of movement in his peripheral vision, dark shapes that vanished the moment he tried to focus on them. At what he guessed was mile 12, he found the first track. It was in a patch of mud on a creek bank, and it stopped him cold. It was enormous, nearly 18 inches long and shaped like a human foot, but far too large and with an anatomy that was subtly wrong. The 5-toe impressions were huge, and the heel was pressed 3 inches into the soft mud, indicating a creature of immense weight, far heavier than any bear. His heart began to hammer in his chest. Then he saw more of them. The creek bank was littered with the tracks, all following the water upstream, deeper into the hollow. He rode on, his peace shattered, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. The feeling of being watched was now a certainty. He found more tracks, dozens of them, some fresh, paralleling the trail. It was clear this path was a regular thoroughfare for whatever made them. He wanted to turn back, but the thought of retracing his steps through this territory was even more terrifying than pushing forward. He had to get out. That's when he heard the first sound. From deep in the woods to his left came a sharp, heavy impact, like a baseball bat striking a tree trunk. It was too loud, too deliberate to be a falling branch. He froze, listening. A minute passed in ringing silence. He forced himself to pedal again, faster now, desperate to put distance behind him. Another impact echoed through the trees, closer this time, then a third, closer still. His blood went cold. They were following him, marking his position, communicating. The horrifying thought that there was more than one, that they were coordinating, sent a wave of nausea through him. The trail climbed onto a narrow ridge, flanked by steep drop-offs. The stench of rot and animal musk was overpowering here. It was a territorial marking, a warning that this place belonged to a predator. A shadow detached itself from the base of a massive cedar 30 yards ahead. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, even in a crouch, and covered in dark, shaggy hair. It moved with an impossible, fluid grace, melting back into the shadows before his mind could fully process what he'd seen. He stood frozen, his mind screaming in denial, until a sound from behind him broke his paralysis. It started as a low, subsonic rumble that he felt in his chest, then rose into a full-throated howl that was neither human nor animal. It was a sound of pure, intelligent rage, a territorial declaration that echoed through the hollow, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Panic took over. Derek threw himself onto his bike and fled, careening down the steep, technical descent at reckless speed. Trees blurred past, rocks and roots jarring his entire body. He didn't care. He just had to get out. After what felt like an eternity, he burst out of the hollow onto a more familiar section of trail. Relief washed over him, so powerful it almost made him weep. He'd made it. He was safe. That's when the answering calls came. One from the north, one from the south, and one from directly ahead on the trail he needed to take to get home. They were coordinated, they were communicating. They had herded him into a trap. From 100 yards up the trail, something large began crashing through the forest toward him. It wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. Derek spun his bike around, but before he'd gone 20 yards, another one materialized from the shadows, blocking his retreat. It was enormous, down on all fours in a knuckle-walking posture, its yellow-gold eyes glowing in the gloom. It stared at him with cold intelligence. Then it charged. Derek reacted on pure instinct, wrenching his bike off the trail and into the dense forest. Branches whipped his face as he fought to stay upright. Behind him, the creature crashed through the undergrowth like a bulldozer. He found a narrow game trail and followed it blindly, his legs pumping with the strength of pure terror. The trail opened onto an old, overgrown logging road. For a moment, he thought he might escape. Then two more shapes emerged from the trees ahead, one on each side of the road, cutting off his path. The one on the left dropped the mangled, half-eaten carcass of a deer. He was surrounded. His only option was a steep embankment to his left that dropped into a ravine. At the last second, he veered off the road, plunging down the slope. Gravity took over. His bike bounced wildly over rocks and logs. He was airborne for a moment, then slammed into the ground. Pain exploded in his shoulder and ribs. As he tumbled down the embankment, his descent stopped by a tree. Above him, he could hear them, all three, vocalizing at the edge of the drop-off. He forced himself to his feet and ran, stumbling toward the sound of a creek. He splashed into the freezing water, running downstream, hoping it would mask his scent. He realized too late where the creek was heading, toward the falls at Blackridge Canyon. The current grew stronger, pulling him toward the roar of falling water. His foot slipped and the current seized him, dragging him over the edge. He fell, tumbling through space, and hit the deep pool below with a bone-jarring impact. The cold water pulled him under. Drowning, disoriented, his body battered, he was tumbled along the bottom until the current deposited him in a shallow area. He crawled onto a rock, gasping, every part of him screaming in pain. He was alive. Above him, at the top of the falls, he heard the creatures. They watched him for a moment. Then their sounds faded. They were leaving. It took him 4 hours to hike out. Soaked, hypothermic, and badly injured, he stumbled onto a Forest Service road at dusk and was found by a ranger named Patterson. In the hospital, he tried to explain, but no one believed him. The police report concluded he'd been spooked by a bear and that his story was a product of trauma and a concussion. They searched for his bike and found it, but the GoPro was gone. 2 months later, a hiker found the camera wedged in the creek. The SD card was intact. Patterson called Derek to the station. They watched the footage together. They saw the tracks. They heard the tree impacts. They saw the fleeting glimpse of the first creature. And then, in those final 90 seconds, they saw them clearly. 3 massive humanoid shapes covered in dark hair, moving with coordinated predatory purpose as they herded him toward the ravine. Patterson sat back, his face pale. "What the hell are those?" he whispered. Derek knew nothing would come of it. The footage was too shaky, the light too poor for it to be definitive proof for a skeptical world, and perhaps that was for the best. Derek sold his truck and his bike and moved to Portland. He works in an office now, surrounded by concrete and people. He never goes back to the mountains. But sometimes, late at night, he remembers. He remembers the smell, the sounds, and the terrifying intelligence in those glowing yellow eyes. He knows the truth. They are out there, they are real, and they are far more dangerous than anyone can imagine because they don't hunt alone. They hunt in packs.